The smallest local AIs only need 16 gigabytes of memory, which means your laptop, phone, and microwave can run them. Oh, and they're also free. They work with the internet off, and even OpenAI say they hold up against the paid model they were selling last year. And the big ones go a heck of a lot further than that. So here are the best free local AIs that you can definitely maybe run. Number 10, Qwen3-235B-A22B. Alibaba's massive original release essentially acts as one model with two gears, cruising in a fast mode when you just want ordinary conversation, and then dropping into a slow thinking mode when you ask it for hard logic, maths, or code. Alibaba have since split that arrangement into separate instruct and thinking releases, so this original is actually the last one that did both of those jobs in a single model. And if you actually have the server space to run it, this is the kind of system a whole company might plug into to build internal tools or securely analyze their private files without sending everything out to an API. Because it is heavily tuned for human preference, it handles creative writing and long roleplay sessions in a way that just feels like talking to a real person, which is why anyone bothers trying to run it at all. But running it at full precision takes roughly 7 or 8 NVIDIA A100 80GB cards, or somewhere north of 26 RTX 4090s worth of memory, which basically turns your spare room into a localized fire hazard. So having a free model at the top of the range just means you can download the weights, but you'll probably still never be able to actually run it on your own machine. Which leaves the obvious open question of whether anything else on this list gets smaller without getting worse. Number 9, GLM-5. This massive 744 billion parameter model from Z.AI was published under open terms that let you take it, change it, and self-host it, even as the company has since moved on to their GLM 5.2 flagship that arrived in June 2026. Under the hood, only a small fraction of the model actually works on any given word, which is what keeps it cheap to serve, and developers run it as a coding agent that one-shots small sites and apps. So if a model is completely free to grab and modify, you might naturally assume you can just pull it down and get to work. But open terms only dictate what you're legally allowed to do, leaving you to deal with the reality of what your hardware can actually hold. Because running it at full precision takes about 1.5 terabytes of video memory. So you're looking at buying dozens of top-end graphics cards just to keep it awake in your house. And even if you grab a heavily squashed 2-bit copy that comes down to roughly 241 gigabytes, you still need a maxed out 256 gigabyte Mac or 124 gigabyte graphics card paired with 256 gigabytes of system memory just to fit it. Which means being completely free to take and totally out of reach are not a contradiction, because the terms mean absolutely nothing if your machine crushes under the weight of the math. So if a free license isn't what decides whether you can run something, what is? Number 8. Mistral Small 4. Having to bounce between different AI tools because one is good at writing code and another is good at general logic is annoying, so Mistral just stopped doing it. Instead, they folded 3 separate model families covering general instruction, reasoning, and coding into a single model, where you can actually dial the logic level up or down per task. It also reads images as well as text, which means a dev team can theoretically retire 4 separate deployments and just route every job to this one. But the word small in the name is doing a hilarious amount of heavy lifting here, because merging all those capabilities into one system makes for a massive file. It sits at 119 billion parameters, and even though it uses a sparse architecture, so only 6.5 billion of them are firing to predict any given word, a heavily squashed local copy still wants somewhere around 70 gigabytes of video memory. Which means one model can now absolutely cover the jobs that used to need 4, but you still can't fit it on a normal desktop. And since you're firmly in server rack territory just to run the supposedly small version, it leaves a pretty obvious gap in the landscape. Does a model actually have to be big to be clever? Number 7, Inkling-Small. Thinking Machines Lab, the startup run by OpenAI's former chief technology officer, shipped this completely open-weight model just 2 weeks after they dropped the massive original Inkling. It sits at 276 billion parameters total, which is roughly a quarter the size of its predecessor. But the clever part is that only 12 billion of those parameters actually wake up to process any given word. It's basically a massive data warehouse where you only flip the lights on in the one specific aisle you happen to be standing in. The company says this aggressively shrunk version still holds its own, reaching comparable performance and staying competitive with the much heavier model on the reasoning and agentic coding tests they published. And since you have the actual weights, you can pull it down and retrain it on your own terrible codebase, instead of renting an API that might secretly judge your formatting. We've reached a point where the number that matters stopped being how big a model is and started being how much of it wakes up per word. Unlike the absolute units we just covered, this is the first one on the list where running it yourself is even a conversation, and there are already published step-by-step setup guides for doing it at home, assuming you have a serious amount of memory. Because even with that extreme efficiency, you still have to park all 276 billion parameters in memory before you can use it, which leaves you wondering if anyone is shipping a model you could just download tonight without having to think about it. Number 6. DeepSeek V4 Flash. It landed on the 31st of July, which makes it the newest model in this countdown by a fortnight. So if a free license isn't what decides whether you can run something, it really just comes down to how much memory you have against how much of the model wakes up per word. DeepSeek V4 Flash is 284 billion parameters, with only 13 billion active, sitting against its bigger sibling's 1.6 trillion, which is the entire reason it's fast and cheap to serve. The whole design trades away some of that massive size in exchange for speed, making it a serious single-person setup that you reach for when you want a fast model answering coding work right away, rather than waiting around for the absolute cleverest model to think slowly. You can grab it right now through LM Studio as something you just download and run yourself, bypassing the cloud APIs entirely. And honestly, how much machine you need depends on how hard you squash the weights, because the small build comes in at roughly 103 gigabytes and fits on a high-end 128 gigabyte unified memory desktop, while a barely squashed copy wants about 162 gigabytes. But either way, it gets you off a rack of servers, assuming you had the budget to buy a machine that size just to talk to it. But since this is the newest release on the board, you have to wonder why the newest one wouldn't simply be the one to get. Number 5. Llama 4 Scout. Meta shipped this as a 109 billion parameter model where roughly 17 billion weights wake up for any given word. And it's properly multimodal, which means it happily reads multiple images alongside your text in a single prompt. But the headline here is its 10 million token context window. To put that number in perspective, 10 million tokens is enough capacity to hand the model your entire codebase, a massive stack of long documents, or literally months of chat history in one go, all without it losing track of what you were talking about. And because you can pull it straight into LM Studio or serve it locally through vLLM and Docker if you want a dedicated API, self-hosting it has become an afternoon's worth of work rather than a serious infrastructure project. Having a working memory that size changes what you bother asking an AI to do, mostly because you just stop trimming things down and writing summaries before you hand them over. But a 10 million token working space sounds physically impossible on an ordinary desktop machine, which forces the question of what opening a window that large actually costs you. Number 4. Gemma 3. Google actually killed this third generation off their own hosted service, and if you run a standard install command today, it reaches straight for Gemma 4. But you want to deliberately specify the older Gemma 3, because it remains completely free to download and run locally, and the family spans from a 270 million parameter version up to 27 billion. While the 270 million and 1 billion versions are text-only with a much shorter memory, the 4 billion, 12 billion, and 27 billion sizes read images right alongside your text. When you squash it down, the 12 billion version only asks for about 6.7 gigabytes of video memory, and even the top-end 27 billion model runs in about 15 gigabytes, which means the whole thing boots up inside the exact same gaming graphics card you probably already use to avoid doing actual work. So if you were wondering whether anyone was finally going to ship a model you could grab tonight without overthinking it, this installs with a single ollama pull command, as long as you name the version. And once it's down, there is no per-word cost, no round trip to a server, and no internet needed at all. At this scale, the decision stops being a purchase and becomes a quick software download you can undo in 30 seconds if it ends up annoying you. But if a model this tiny is genuinely smart enough to be useful, you have to wonder what the point of the enormous 200 and 700 billion parameter models we started with even is anymore. Number 3. Phi-4 reasoning. This is Microsoft's 14 billion parameter model, and it ships completely free under the MIT license. Squashed down, it needs about 13.8 gigabytes of video memory, which means it slides comfortably into an ordinary 16 gigabyte gaming card. You start it with a single ollama run command, and suddenly you have a machine built specifically for multi-step logic, complex maths, and planning work. According to Microsoft's own technical report, this tiny footprint is beating significantly larger models across a broad set of reasoning benchmarks, with a Reasoning Plus variant pushing further still. Which raises the question of how a 14 billion parameter lightweight manages to bully models many times its size. It turns out that building a clever model is largely an issue of training data. Microsoft fine-tuned it on a curated list of exceptionally difficult problems, deliberately feeding it the step-by-step reasoning paths generated by O3 Mini. So the network learned how to process an idea slowly instead of just blindly blurting out a memorized answer like a student who only skimmed the Wikipedia summary. So instead of being bigger, a small model just spends its effort taking longer over the answer. That efficiency is exactly why you can grab the weights directly off Hugging Face right now and run it on the kind of hardware the massive models it routinely beats never will. But notice that every model we have looked at so far has come from somebody else. What exactly happened when OpenAI finally decided to open one of their own models up? Number 2. GPT-OSS-20B. What happened is we got the exact model behind the 16 gigabytes from the intro, which dropped as the smaller of two releases when OpenAI published a post introducing GPT-OSS in August of last year. It's their first actual open weights release since the GPT-2 days, and they decided to put the whole thing out under an Apache 2.0 license, which means you can self-host it, change the underlying code, and bake it directly into some deeply cursed startup idea without ever asking anyone's permission or paying a single royalty. Their own launch post puts this smaller model right in the same territory as O3 Mini, meaning you're getting the reasoning of the paid model they were selling last year, executing completely offline. And since it fits on everyday desktops with as little as 16 gigabytes of memory, this year-old model is still the absolute first thing most people should install when they want local AI that just works. But that leaves a fairly obvious question standing. If the little one in the family is this good, what exactly does the big one do? Number 1. GPT-OSS-120B. This is the big sibling to the 20 billion parameter model we just looked at, and it's the actual answer to what happens when OpenAI decides to give away something massive under an Apache 2.0 license. In their own announcement, they claim this thing hits near parity with OpenAI O4 Mini on core reasoning, but it was built specifically so you can cram it onto a single 80 gigabyte GPU. It's designed as a backbone for agents that stay on the long job, which means developers are wiring it into local pipelines to review, fix, and write code end-to-end without needing a human to babysit it. Its logic is close enough to the paid frontier that the gap has mostly stopped being the interesting part, and you can see that in what normal people are actually running it on. Over on the Level 1 text forum, a user reported pulling over 30 tokens a second running GPT-OSS120B on a 128GB Strix Halo mini PC through a Vulkan backend. You're looking at a literal box that sits on a desk, completely bypassing the need for a rented server. So the best free AI model you can genuinely own right now runs entirely offline on one machine you could realistically just go out and buy. But that leaves one fairly obvious question standing. Out of everything we just went through, which one do you actually download first? So the one that runs through this entire list is just the memory in the machine you already own. Because when you run things locally, your speed is governed by memory bandwidth rather than raw compute. This is why a workstation with a massive pool of slower memory easily beats a fast graphics card like an RTX 4090 that simply can't fit the model at all. If you're constrained to an ordinary gaming card, that puts you squarely in Gemma 3 and 5.4 reasoning territory. Stepping up to 16 gigabytes is what actually reaches GPT-OSS20B. A 128 gigabyte unified memory machine runs the #1 model, and the very largest ones on this list need even more than that. Ultimately, the right download has nothing to do with whichever lab happens to be topping a chart this week, because the choice is already made by the hardware sitting on your desk. Anyways, that's all folks.